change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Matthew. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
So last week, in the last verse of chapter 16, Jesus is telling his disciples that there's some standing right here that are not going to taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his glory. And now we're given a time period, and it says 6 days later, where in Luke it'll say some 8 days after, but that's just a Greek expression like we would say in about a week. So Jesus is traveling with only 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, and they're going to a high mountain. And most would probably say that this mountain was Mount Hermon, which can be seen from Caesarea Philippi, because it's not too far from there. And this is a high mountain. It's about 9,300 feet high. But some would argue that this mountain would have been too cold for them to have spent the night there. And the traditional site of the Transfiguration is Mount Tabor. But Mount Tabor, it's not really a very high mountain. It's only about 1,850 feet. In this mountain, it's kind of like a round hill, and it has a flat spot on the top of it. And the critics will say that this mountain was probably fortified at this time during Jesus' era, and they wouldn't have had access to that mountain. But there's still a third possibility, and that would have been Mount Meron, and it's not really held by a lot of people, but it's located right between Caesarea Philippi and Capernaum. But nobody knows for sure where this happened because they didn't give us enough information. And it's probably good because when we know of a place, what people tend to do, they go make some kind of shrine or they go put a church there and they consider the place holy. But that's not what's important here. What's important is what happened, what occurred there. And this event, it's also recorded in the Gospels of Mark and Luke. And we're told in those Gospels that the reason Jesus went up there with these disciples was to pray. And what happened to these disciples is what also happens to a lot of us when we start to close our eyes to pray. They fell asleep. And you can imagine climbing a high mountain and you'd close your eyes, you'd probably just start to drift off. And then you have Jesus here, and he's praying alone. And then Luke tells us that his apparel changed. And his clothes are described to be as white like lightning, bright. And lightning's pretty bright. But it's not only Jesus' clothes that changed, but his countenance was altered. And it says that Jesus' face shone so bright that it was like the sun. And it's not saying that Jesus' face changed to be like the sun, but that it was his face and that his face was shining like the sun. So I imagine the disciples, they're taking their nap, and Jesus' face just kept getting brighter and brighter and brighter. And it's like in the morning, like when the sun wakes you up, but this time it's actually the brightness of Jesus' face that woke them. And when they woke, it wasn't just Jesus' face, it was everything about him was glowing and bright because he was full of glory. And you know how you can't look directly at the sun very long. I don't think that these men could have looked at his face very long without being blinded. And this wasn't just a light shining on Jesus' face. This is all coming from inside of Jesus. It's shining from him, out of him. This is the glory that radiates from him. And it's always been there, and it's been there from all of time. It's only been hidden from them because he's been restraining it. And then we're told in Revelation 21:23 that when we get to the New Jerusalem, that we won't need the sun or the moon, that Jesus will be our light there. And so this transfiguration of Jesus that helps us to be able to make sense of that verse. And that also helps us in the creation of the world, where it says there was light before there was ever created a sun, a moon, or stars, back in the book of Genesis. And this word of transfiguration, that's where we get our English word metamorphosis. And so now you got these disciples, and they're fully awake. And in the other Gospels, it says that they were afraid. And if you've ever noticed in the Gospels that Jesus is always taking Peter, James, and John with him to these different places where he doesn't take all the other disciples. Jesus had taken these 3 disciples into that house and the healing of Jairus' daughter when he brought her back from the dead. And these are the same 3 that Jesus will take with him to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane before his crucifixion. If you notice, every time Jesus takes these guys to go pray, they always fall asleep. So we're kind of in good company. A lot of times when I start talking, everybody starts getting a little drowsy, start falling asleep. It's okay. But the reason I think he took these guys with him, it's not so much that he had to keep an eye on these guys, but I believe that he considered these 3 to be his close friends, that Jesus actually enjoyed their company and he enjoyed the time that he spent with them. And so now they're awake and they see Jesus in all his glory. And now Jesus is talking to these 2 other guys that didn't come up the mountain with them. And they recognize these guys. And it's Moses and Elijah. And we don't know how they recognized them, but maybe Jesus was calling them Mo and Eli or something. So you have to realize that Moses, he hadn't lived on earth now for about 1,400 years. And Elijah, he hasn't been around for over 900 years. And people will tell you the reason that it was Moses and that it was Elijah is because Moses, he represented the law, and Elijah, he represented the prophets. And we've been seeing this whole time with Jesus and the Pharisees that they've been fighting, and they've been trying to cause this division between Moses and the law and Jesus. But now they're talking, and we don't see any division between them here. In fact, you see them kind of getting along quite well. And so with these 2 together, Moses and Elijah, here at the Transfiguration, many people believe that these 2 will be those prophets that will appear during the Great Tribulation in the book of Revelation, the ones that are killed in the sight of the whole world. And the thing is that these 2 prophets, they do the same types of signs that Moses and Elijah did when they were in their own ministries on earth, where they would shut up the skies and they'd cause the water to turn into blood. And so they're also there, they're shining. In one of the Gospels says that they're also in glory, and they're not there to talk to the disciples, but in Luke 9:31, it tells us why they are there and what they're talking about with Jesus. And it says they're talking about Jesus's departure. And that word for departure there in Greek is the word exodus. So it's the same word used for the Jews when they left Egypt. So now they're talking about Jesus' death and his exodus that's soon to occur in Jerusalem. And that's what death is for us too as believers. It's just a departure. It's just an exodus. It's our exodus of our bondage in this earth to this new life in the glory of heaven. And Peter, when he describes his soon coming death, his departure, he uses that same exact word. He uses that word exodus in his New Testament letter. So there's another reason in my mind that I think it was Moses and Elijah that came to speak with Jesus. Because I think and I believe that just like how Peter, James, and John were Jesus' close friends, I believe Moses and Elijah were also close friends of his. Because when you read about Moses and how he met with God every day in the tabernacle, we're told that God spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. And we see that same kind of relationship where God spoke plainly to Elijah in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings. And I'm going to guess that they probably, before Jesus became a man, they spoke together often. And I really like this idea where Jesus considers us his friends, that Jesus, he not only loves us, but he likes us. and that he enjoys the time he spends with us. And so he's not only our God and Savior, but even with all our flaws, he considers us as friends. We have these kind of relationships in our own wives, in our own family relationships. Rebecca, she's my wife, but sometimes she's also my friend. And it's the same with my children, and it's the same with my mom. And so now Jesus, he starts speaking about his impending death with Moses and Elijah. And so this proves to us that Jesus' suffering and his death will not be an accident. And so now Peter, he's fully awake and he's afraid. And then he's seeing that Moses and Elijah, that they're departing. And Peter, he doesn't want this mountaintop experience to end. And so Peter interrupts. And in Mark's and Luke's gospel, we're told that Peter, he didn't know what he was saying. So he's a little overcome by seeing all this. And so he's thinking that maybe he should say something to keep things going on. And I understand this because I say stupid things all the time, where I should just keep my mouth shut. And Peter says, he says, it's good for us to be here. Well, I don't really know if it was good for Peter to be there, but I'm going to guess it was. Jesus did bring him along. And then Peter says, if you wish, let us make here 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And a tabernacle is a tent. That's the common word for a tent. But sometimes it refers to these shelters that they make out of branches. And so what Peter's wanting to do here is he's thinking if he can make these shelters for these guys, they can stay there and they can spend the night. And we're told that Peter was going to keep on speaking, but God the Father, he interrupts Peter. And that's pretty bad when God himself has to stop you because you're saying things that are just so foolish. And so now you have God here and he's speaking from behind a cloud. And that's because they can see God's presence and live because God is so much greater, so much power. He's described as being a consuming fire. And just by seeing Jesus in his glory, they were already afraid. And that's what always happens when anybody sees Jesus in his glorified state. We see that with the Apostle John in Revelation. When he sees Jesus in his glorified state, he fell down like a dead man. And so now God speaks, and it's terrifying. And it's not because of what he says, but it's because of his great power. Did you guys hear the thunder last night? 4:30. It was really loud, and it lasted for a really long time because I wasn't even going to say anything about it. But that's how God's voice is described. It's described like thunder or like roaring water. And when it describes God's voice, it says that it breaks the cedars in Lebanon and it causes deers to give birth. So his voice is really, really powerful. But all God said here was the same exact thing that he spoke at Jesus' baptism. He said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." And then he just adds, "Listen to him." Or where it says here, it says, "Hear him." So God, he didn't say anything scary. It's just his voice that's terrifying because it's like thunder or like roaring water. And what Peter got in trouble for here is not that he wanted this experience to continue on and to go on for a while, but it was that he's putting Jesus on an equal level as Moses and Elijah. That was his mistake because Moses and Elijah, they're just men like we are. They're just people. And so now they're all laying there and they're thinking that they're going to die, but then everything just goes right back to normal. And Jesus just comes behind them and touches them, and he's not mad at all. And he tells them not to be afraid. So I take from that God didn't speak to scare them, but it was to correct them. Because the truth is that Peter was right, that it was good for him to be there. And so Jesus tells them on the way down not to tell anybody about the vision until he's risen from the dead. And so now we hear that this is a vision. But this is a vision that they all 3 saw. And this is something that they will never forget, because we'll see that Peter and John, they both write about this event, about beholding Jesus' glory. James, he didn't write anything. We have no writings from him, but that might be because he was also the first apostle that was martyred after Jesus' resurrection. And so now they're all coming down off the mountain, and they had just seen Elijah. So naturally, they've got questions about him because they've been taught things in the scriptures, and they don't really quite understand how this all works together. Because they were taught that Elijah would come first to prepare and establish the kingdom. And you can find that in Malachi chapter 4. And so they're wondering if this appearance of Elijah, if that is this fulfillment of prophecy. And then Jesus, he gives them a two-part answer. And his answer really doesn't make it any clearer for us, because Jesus does say that Elijah, he will come first, and that he will restore all things, like it says in Malachi. And so right here, Jesus, he's talking about the future. And that's kind of where we get that idea of Elijah being one of those two witnesses that we read about in the book of Revelation. And Moses also, because they both appeared at the transfiguration. So a lot of people believe it will be Elijah and Moses, because like we said, they do perform the same kind of miracles that they did during their ministries. You know, the shutting up the heavens and turning the water into blood. But then Jesus, he goes on and he says, Elijah's already come, but nobody knew him. And the disciples here, they know that he's talking about John the Baptist. And this is the second time Jesus has said something like this about John the Baptist, about him being Elijah. Because the first time we read it in Matthew chapter 11. And this can be confusing because we don't understand how people can live more than one time. And no one has ever explained this to us, because we do know that we don't believe in reincarnation. And even when John the Baptist, when he was asked directly, he says, "Are you Elijah?" He said really clearly, he says, "I am not." And people will try to explain this to you about John the Baptist came in the power of Elijah. But I'm really not sure about that. I leave this category alone in the things that I don't know, into the things that I don't understand. And I am okay with that, because I can believe things that I can't understand, and I can still believe they're true, especially when Jesus says them. And so Jesus tells these three that just like John the Baptist suffered at their hands, that he would also be suffering at the hands of these men. And so now they're down from the mountain, because we never live in our mountaintop experiences. We, just like them, we generally live down here in the valley, where there's always a lot of chaos going on. And in our gospel here in Matthew, the first thing we see is that there's a father who's kneeling before Jesus, and he's pleading for Jesus to have mercy on his son. And this account, it also is written in the Gospels of Mark and Luke. But in Luke and in Mark, they have a lot more details. And we learn that this is this man's only son. And we're also told that before this man came kneeling down before Jesus, that Jesus had just caught up with his other disciples, the other 9, the ones that he left behind. And that there's this crowd around them, and the scribes were arguing with the disciples. But then when the crowd, they recognized Jesus, they all started running toward Jesus. And then Jesus asked those 9 disciples that were left behind, he says, "What are you arguing with the scribes about?" But before the disciples gave Jesus an answer, that's where Matthew's account begins. And this father, he runs to Jesus and he kneels and he pleads with Jesus for his son. And so back in Matthew, it says that the father tells Jesus that his son is an epileptic. And this word here, translated epileptic, is actually the word moonstruck. And that's our word for calling somebody a lunatic, that this son was out of his mind. And then we learn from Mark's gospel, and this is in Mark, that this father describes the son as of having a mute spirit. And then he describes what this mute spirit does to his son. Now, this is where I believe the translators in Matthew decided to pick the word epileptic instead of the word lunatic because of his father's description of this demonic attack. Because what he describes there, it looks like an epileptic attack. Because in Mark, the father says, it seizes him, it throws him down, he foams at the mouth, and he gnashes his teeth, and he becomes rigid. And then the father says to Jesus that he brought his son to these disciples, but they couldn't cure him. So now Jesus knows exactly what the scribes and his disciples were fighting about. It was all about these disciples casting out this demon. And so then what Jesus does is he rebukes his disciples. And it seems like what he says seems really rough. "O faithless and perverse generations, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you?" So that seems harsh. And they probably, at this time, just seeing Jesus and having all these hard experiences, they probably have rather have had like a hug or an arm put around them, that Jesus would be understanding what they'd gone through. They probably weren't really thinking he was going to go and call them perverse. They were probably thinking, well, maybe he'd say, "Well, good try, men." And so this rebuke must have been a little bit tough for him. But you have to remember with Jesus, even though he's direct, Jesus is never mean. And Jesus will explain this rebuke later. But now Jesus says, bring the boy to him. So in Mark, we're told that this demon had one last demonstration, and he acted out one last time before being cast out. And it's when that demon saw Jesus, and it says, immediately the spirit convulsed him and fell on the ground, and he wallowed, foaming at the mouth. And we're told, before he casts out the demon, we're told he asked the father a question. And he says, how long has this been happening to him? And then the father says, from childhood. And so this demon has had control of this boy for a long time. And so we see again here, just like with the daughter of the Canaanite woman, that demons can affect children even from a young age. So now this father's life, it seems like it's been reduced to this being more of a caretaker. And that's because this boy, he can't be left alone, because this demon causes this boy to be suicidal. Because the father tells Jesus that these suicidal attempts, that they happen often. And he says, often he has thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. And I've heard a lot of good teachers like Chuck Swindoll say that suicidal tendencies are very much related to demonic activity. And this is not saying that anyone who has a suicidal thought is demon-possessed, but that it's the natural tendency for humans to live, because we naturally fight to live. So thoughts of our own destruction, they don't originate from us. They originate from hell. So this father, he's been living this nightmare for a long time. And we're told in Mark that the father, he's on his knees and he's before Jesus. And I can imagine he's barely able to hold back these tears from streaming down his face. And then he asks Jesus, but if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us.
To let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,